When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow.
Welcome to the OShow, Canada's current affairs show with strong opinions. I'm your host, Laura Babcock. And as promised during the last show with David Moskrip, when we talked about all things national in Canada and US and the world, today we have with us former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, because if you care about Canadian democracy, about the environment, about Indigenous nations, and about not ramming through legislation that could be harmful to the environment and many other concerns, then you're going to want to care about what Kathleen and I need to talk about today, which is Ford's big bad Bill 5. And I've got a lot of concerns about it, as well as more on the Greenbelt scandal and news that just came out about how Ford is spending some of our tax dollars to enrich some of his MPPs. Don't love it. I'm kind of mad, but Kathleen's used to that. So Kathleen, welcome back to the OShow.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have been very concerned and very vocal yourself, much more so than I, on Bill 5. So for people who are unfamiliar with this, I mean, something happened last night that I think might have been historic at Queen's Park, and you can let me know. But there was a filibuster staged by the opposition parties to prevent Ford from doing this, GOP MAGA overnight trying to ram through a bill. They filibustered. They stayed up all night so that it can't possibly, as I understand it, go through before Monday. So can you talk to me about what's so wrong about this bill that it would cause the opposition parties to stay up all night?
So this bill is called the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act. And what it really is trying to do, Laura, is sweep away environmental protections, sweep away decades of protections of endangered species, change the rules around the way development can happen on major projects, and introduce a real degree of subjectivity into these decisions that previously have been based in science. So I'm very, very worried about where this legislation is going. I think that it has run roughshod over Indigenous, particularly First Nations concerns in the North. I was listening to committee hearings last week, and there were a number of First Nations groups who came and said, this is not right. You have not consulted with us. This is not good for the environment and not good for our communities. So I think that the government has really overreached, as it does, and the filibuster. The opposition parties, all of them, have tried to get a hearing in Thunder Bay, at least to get one more hearing out of Southern Ontario. That wasn't happening, and so I think the frustration around the legislation and all the groups that have come together to say we're very worried about this, that really fueled the opposition's desire to at least push this off until the fall if possible.
Well, I can't help but look at this as a power grab, right? We had a Premier Ford who had two mandates where, as you and I have discussed in the past, mired in scandal and trying to take opportunities that I feel like, governed by fiat, have such power over the majority, such power over the caucus, that Ford seems to be able to do what he wants. And this is why so many of us pushed during this quick election back in February, don't give another majority mandate to this Premier, because I personally don't think he's earned the trust of the people of Ontario. And when you have a premier like Ford who doesn't have the trust because of the Greenbelt scandal and other things like Staples, Ontario Place, and the Science Centre, it's hard to believe that this bill is not just about economic zones and mining and the Ring of Fire in the north, that this bill is more about removing the ability, not just for First Nations to have consultation, but for, we saw him come at municipalities and try to strip away their ability to stop development. So it almost feels to me like a power grab, and almost maybe the Greenbelt is in the sights of this thing. I don't know. I'm not a conspiracist, but I can't help think that it's an end run to get back into the Greenbelt by saying, oh, this has to be an economic zone. And this other area that previously we couldn't touch for 1,000 different reasons, it's an economic zone. That means, wipe our hands of consultation.
Well, and that's one of the problems with this, is that it's very subjective what can be designated an economic zone, right? And so those approvals now are sitting in the hands of the minister. One of the amendments that the government apparently is bringing forward is that there would be an economic zone for First Nations communities, that they would have the opportunity to create an economic zone. But again, that does not speak to environmental protections. It doesn't speak to the use of science to actually determine what we should and shouldn't be doing. And, politicians have lots of skills, but they're not necessarily able to make decisions about environment, the habitat of species. It was interesting to me, Laura, that a representative of the Toronto Zoo came to the hearings and spoke to the dangers of this legislation. Because one of the things that the legislation does is it removes the Endangered Species Act and replaces it with a weaker piece of legislation. But in that new act, the definition of the habitat of endangered species is very narrowly defined. So it's just the den or the place that the animal actually lives. It's not where they wander, where they gather their food, how much, the land that they need in order to survive. So it's that kind of detail that I think this government has not paid attention to, because their focus is solely on what they're calling economic development. And their definition of the economy is also very narrow, Laura. It's about the revenue that comes in and the revenue that goes out, and it's about the balance sheet. It is not about people's lives. It is not about the quality of our water. It's not about the quality of our air, and it's not about biodiversity. And I would argue that all of those things are part of the economy. We just don't label them that way, and that is a huge mistake that we have made as for generations, that we've made as government and as a society.
Well, I think we know, and certainly on our scandal panel, Mark Cripps, who not only worked in government with housing and other files, but also works in environmental insurance now. The cost that people are going to have to pay in insurance because we haven't mitigated and prevented exploitation of our environment. I mean, there is a real cost to not putting environmental considerations into economic policy. And I'll take it even further than you. These are my words, not yours, Kathleen. I don't think that Doug Ford's Ontario's economy and the economic focus takes into consideration the quality of life of Ontarians who aren't on the upper ranges of income. When we look at 81,000 Ontarians in homelessness, did that come up in the budget? Was that a priority, right? How can you say that we're going to have economic zones and build all this prosperity and then show us evidence that that prosperity benefits wealthy developers, benefits people who can purchase these houses? And we never got that $100,000 picket fenced house that Ford promised us, right? Where did that go? What we see is that the prosperity goes to developers, goes to contractors who work with the Ford government, goes to donors, goes to third party, private healthcare providers. It doesn't go to the people in the hospitals, and it sure doesn't go to the people who are suffering on the streets and need harm reduction. So anything that this government does to, build the economy, I look at it and say, for who? Who is Doug Ford and his government building the economy for? Are they building it for the rich, or are they building it for the rest of us?
Well, and you raise a really good point. And it's interesting, Laura, when I teach my public policy courses at U of T, I open the class, the first class, we talk about it being a course about government policy, and always asking the question, who's this policy for? Who's excluded and who's included? Because that has to be the question when you're developing policy. And if you're talking about who is benefiting from these policies that Doug Ford and his government are bringing in, I would suggest to you, we don't even really know. And that's the problem, right? There isn't the transparency about who is benefiting and who isn't. And this piece of legislation is only going to exacerbate that, because it makes it more subjective, these decisions around environment, these decisions around these major projects, some of which haven't even been debated in the public realm. I mean, the tunnel under the 401, is that a good idea? Even if it's possible to build, which I guess anything's possible, but is it a good idea? Is that something that we actually need? Or are there other things that we could do that would actually be better for commuters and would be better for the environment? So we're not having those conversations, and this legislation is another example of removing those important debates from the public realm. And I think the opposition has done a good job now in sort of pushing off the ultimate passage of this legislation. I think that the First Nations leaders who came to the committee, I think that was very important. I think the mayor of the town who came, who was talking about the landfill site that in I think it was in Chatham, Kent, that they were going to ram through, and he was saying, even his own member who was a Conservative MPP was saying this is not the right place for this landfill site. Those are all things that should be discussed, but they should be discussed before the legislation is written, right? That's the homework part.
Well, so a couple of things. I mean, what we're hearing from the opposition is this should be dead on arrival, this bill, because there wasn't the consultation done. You're hearing from First Nations saying, this shouldn't even go forward. Forget about a little, tweaking to it. The duty to consult that's constitutionally provided for them should have happened prior to this thing getting to the point that it's at. So I find my frustration often with very good-willed political parties in opposition to these populist conservative parties, whether we're talking about in Canada, the US, or elsewhere, is that they have a hard time putting a clear message around something. So is Bill 5 the mining bill? Is it the environment bill? Is it about First Nations? I think it is, given that Trump tried to push through the big, beautiful bill in Congress that was going to take money from the poor and give it to the rich, I see this as the big, bad Bill 5. Let's give it a name and let's explain to people that it is ultimately a power grab. You can look at any one of those issues that you brought up and say, oh, this needs to be done, homework here, The bigger picture is what Ford government is trying to do with its power. And so I look at how they took the fear of the Trump tariffs and the trade war and Ford's brief stint as Captain Canada until Carney got in there. And they took that and said, here's the opportunity to get that majority back and to get ahead of all of the criticism we've faced over the Greenbelt scandal and the Science Centre and Ontario Place, et cetera, et cetera. They rammed it through. Worst month of the year for an election. People couldn't even get to the polls if they had, there's so much snow. It was a terrible, I think, cynical thing to do. He got a majority, not a huge mandate, but he got another majority. And then what is he doing? Taking a Trump tactic after using Trump as the motivator. And the Trump tactic is to say, how much power can we grab? How fast? Right? Let's put it into this bill. Let's take away the ability for municipalities to stand up against what we want. I mean, we saw them already do tons and tons of MZOs, private multiple zoning orders, unlike your government, way more, right? We saw them literally not want to hand over emails on the Greenbelt. It keeps coming out about, a developer sending an email saying, thanks for fixing the glitch with the Greenbelt, as though something that Ontarians have fought for generations is just a glitch for this government, right? For their pals. So to me, I think the language has to be around Bill 5. This is about taking power away from the people. This is about profiting, if they go to their if past is predicate for future, profiting the wealthy at the expense of the people of Ontario. An economic zone that has no consultation and no regulation to it is nothing to me but a cash grab for the Ford Connected. And I might be overstating it, but I don't think you crack through to people how critical this kind of legislation is and this kind of tactic of overnight, committees and stuff. This is straight out of MAGA playbook in the South. And we know that Ford admires Trump. I mean, Canadians, I think, across the country, Kathleen, have to be very concerned that Conservative premiers are adopting some of these tactics.
Well, the overnight sittings are not unknown to Queen's Park. That happens, and it happened for days on end when Mike Harris was the premier, and there was a group of us who were trying to stop the takeover of the amalgamation of the city of Toronto. So, you're right that when there is a blatant power grab like this, people are going to object. People are going to stand up, and I think you're right too in terms of labeling this legislation for what it is, which is the centralizing of power and authority in the hands of these politicians, and pushing aside all of the due process. That's what we're talking about. Due process goes out the window because these guys are impatient and they think they have all the answers, but they're not listening to people who have actually got more information than they do. They're not listening to them, they're not heeding them, and they make mistakes. That's what happens when you don't listen to people who actually have information. So I think we need to be very concerned about it, and I think we do need to raise our voices, which is why you and I are having this conversation. And the opposition parties will do what they can, but they have to be operating in a context where people outside of government are supporting them, right? And so I think it's really important. I think there are 100 environmental groups who have signed a letter. Doug Ford, he marginalizes environmental groups and calls them radical environmentalists. Well, they actually are people who have spent their lives, many of them, exploring and understanding and studying how the environment works. You can write off First Nations people and you can say, we don't have to listen to them, but they have been very clear, and they were very clear in the hearings, that these projects will not go ahead without their support. It is their land, their communities, and they will take to the streets. They will block these projects going ahead. And I think that's something that this government has to pay attention to. And good on the First Nations and the Indigenous communities for saying, you're not going to listen to us, then we're going to rise up and we're going to express our concern because our future is at stake. What we have to understand as people who are not Indigenous and who have maybe been closer to government or live in Southern Ontario, it's our future too. The endangered species and the well-being of the environment in this province doesn't just affect people in the north. The people in the north may be affected earlier, but we have to pay attention, and we haven't. We just have not.
Well, and it's interesting because when we talk about messaging and rallying the people, getting them to rise up, when I got involved with the Greenbelt scandal hashtag, it was because I found that as someone who's not been deeply environmentally conscious like yourself, Kathleen, my whole life, I was more outraged on a visceral, emotional level by the brazenness of lying to camera and saying, I heard you folks, I will not touch the Greenbelt, and then finding out that that's in fact what they did.
Right.
So there was a righteous indignation of it. And if you're not getting to people in an emotional way as a leader in 2025, if you are not touching into the emotions of your audience and making them feel a certain kind of way about something that's important, you're less likely to get the response that maybe traditionally you might have got a decade ago. But now there's so much noise and so much distraction that if people don't feel it, they're not going to get up and do something about it. And so the discussion around the Greenbelt scandal, my opinion, had it been left to the environmental conversation only, it might not have had as much of a fire behind it. And let's face it, Ford capitulated when he saw the crowds blocking him at Ford Fest, when he saw the fact that people were going to take to the streets and they weren't going to stop, right? That's the moment where I felt like his campaign, because remember, we heard that they thought it'd blow over in 2 weeks, so we sustained it for months. And that kind of public sustaining, as you know, of a protest issue is exhausting. And governments count on people not having the time or the energy to do it. So I think as broadly as people can understand the risk of the power grab of Bill 5, people can say this is not just about the Ring of Fire up north and about First Nations. This is about all of us in Ontario, because Kathleen, frankly, if First Nation stands up and blocks the projects around the Ring of Fire, what's to say they're not going to declare the Greenbelt in Southern Ontario an economic zone? What's to say they're not going to take these other precious areas and decide that it'd be better with condo towers there? What about Coots Paradise in Hamilton? What about, this World Biosphere?
Exactly.
How do we know that they might not? They might say, okay, we can't do it there because those groups stood up to us, but now we have carte blanche because it's legal for us now to supersede any kind of duty to consult with anybody, municipalities, environmental groups, any NIMBY interests or whatever. It's terrifying to me.
Well, and I mean, Yes, it is. That kind of random, subjective grab of control and authority is very dangerous. It's very dangerous in a democracy. Um, and I think that the voices from First Nations, particularly in that northwestern Ontario, the Ring of Fire and the mining communities, um, those voices are very important because the whole pretense for this legislation is that it is about protecting Ontario in the face of Trump's threats. So when we hear the Prime Minister talking about the need for these precious minerals and so on, and we hear the provincial government talking about the same thing, we get, I think, even at an emotional level, that this is very important in terms of our economy going forward. But at the same time, there has to be this process, and it's only, it's those First Nations voices that are intimately involved with the land, who understand the seasons and the land and the geography that both the Prime Minister and the Premier are talking about. And sure, do we have to look at streamlining processes so that they work as well as they can? Our government was looking at how to make sure that there wasn't duplication between federal environmental assessment and provincial assessments. That's not a bad thing to do, but to remove those protections altogether is just so short-sighted. And it's the kind of thing that has led to degradation in the past. I was talking earlier today about situations like the situation at Grassy Narrows, that in the Grassy Narrows, northwestern Ontario community, where there was the Domtar plant was there, and there were chemicals leached into the river, particularly mercury, that has created generations of illness among people in the community. We can't risk, they can't risk, those communities can't risk that happening again. And left to our own devices as, the government of Ontario, those mistakes have been made in the past. Canadian governments have made mistakes. So the First Nations governments need to stand up and say, we're not going to let this happen again, and more power to them, quite frankly.
And we all need to support them because they're on the front line, as you said, know more, have done more, have been here longer. They understand more about the risk. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, where you and I think are always come to a little bit of a separation is in terms of motivation, or you're just more diplomatic and gracious and believe more in people than I do, Kathleen. But when you talk about, they're just not listening to the experts, I'm like, they don't care. They do not care. They do not care about communities that aren't going to be gated with cars and access to nearby highways like the 413. They do not care about people who are not, business owners. I myself, a business owner, but you know what? I'm probably one of those whack job lefties in their mind. I mean, they do not care about people who are not ideologically aligned with what Doug Ford wants to do. This populist, and I'm going to say it reminds me of MAGA. More and more that we talk about it, the more it sounds like a Donald Trump situation where, everybody just does what Ford wants them to do. He's highly competitive, as you've shared before on this program. They are not accidentally circumventing duty to consult. They are not accidentally doing any of this. They had 2 mandates, almost got driven out of office. If we hadn't had this whole Trump thing, they probably wouldn't have won a third. And yet here we are, they have another one and they're not going to waste it. And so I think we have to look at just an example today, Kathleen. Their ministers who are already making north of $120,000 got a 35% pay raise today from Ford, unless I read that reporting wrong, plus, some sort of thing with the benefits. But a 35% pay raise at a time when he's making this argument about needing to get rid of these consulting processes and policies and all the rest of the things that operate this province like a democracy, all those need to go because urgently we got to build this economy to survive Trump's tariffs. But I'm going to take $6 million and give it to out of the fealty to my MPPs who stood with me. I mean, I'm looking at that and saying, how can this not make people insane?
Well, I think it probably will anger people, but I have to take an opposing view on this because the salaries of MPPs have been frozen since I think 2008, 2009. They have fallen way behind their federal counterparts, way behind many city councillors. And I think that we have to be careful that we can draw people from a whole range of backgrounds into politics. So I actually think this was probably something that he needed to do, unless we're going to say, you know what, we're going to pay all politicians below whatever, pick a rate. Then if we're not going to say that, then we've got to keep them competitive. And I know that when people think about getting into politics, if they are in a job in the private sector that's paying them a lot of money, sometimes it can be a real push to get them to think about coming into the legislature. The base pay for an MPP was $116,000 a year. Now, that is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's way above the average for many people, most people in the country. But at the same time, I can tell you by 2018, when I was coming out of, when we lost government, there was already a lot of concern among legislators that they either didn't want to retire because they couldn't afford to, which means that people stay past their due date or past their expiry date, and getting new people to come in will become more of a problem. So I actually, much as I disagree with pretty much everything this government does, I think they had to move on this one. It was going to happen inevitably. In the early 2000s, under Dalton McGuinty, we had passed legislation that said that MPP salaries would go up and be tagged to the federal salaries at 75%. Okay, so a provincial MPP in Ontario would make 75% of what a federal MP would make. But then we had the economic downturn and Dalton put a freeze on, and it has stayed on since then. So had to change, and it will be unpopular, I'm sure, but I think it is justifiable.
You know what? I have no issue with people getting paid what they're worth, especially when it's commensurate with another job similar to what they're doing. What I have an issue with is telling the people of Ontario that we had to have a rush election and we had to make sure that he got another mandate because we're in such an economic crisis and we have to have a huge budget deficit and we have to create these economic zones where there's no restrictions on this government who has broken our trust. The Ford government is making an argument that Ontario is in such a precarious economic situation that the rule of law and how we process our democracy has to be a secondary consideration so we can make the economy stronger. And you've got them giving their MPPs as a priority, $175,000 or so as a base salary on top of all of their other gigs they get paid for. And you got people, the 8,000 people laid off by the Bay. You've got the people whose car plants are shutting down and they can't get jobs. The timing of this is obnoxious and arrogant. If he did this in 6 months, when we're over this horrendous window of whatever Trump's going to do next, but you can't suck and blow. The Premier can't say we're in a crisis. That means we supersede the duty to consult. And yet we've got money that we can give these MPPs close to $200,000 salaries. I just think that it goes.
I totally agree with you. And, parents of kids with autism, kids who are not getting the support they need in colleges and universities. They see $6 million going to these salaries. I totally agree with you. The juxtaposition of those things is very, very problematic. So you won't get any argument from me there. I just think in absolute terms, it had to happen at some point.
Sure. It goes to me about how much power this Premier now thinks he has, that he can run over the rights of Indigenous people, that he can continue to stall on the Greenbelt scandal. I mean, where's the RCMP, Kathleen? Where are they in the Greenbelt scandal?
Well, clearly the work is ongoing, Laura, because we keep, as you say, we keep getting these little snippets of people who, who have been interviewed, or, there are reports coming out from various sources. So the work is ongoing. I think I said this to you on one of our previous conversations. I don't think this is over yet, but we'll see. Maybe maybe it's not going to amount to anything, but it's hard for me to believe that there isn't some connection between what happened and decisions made by the premier. But
Well, you said you said quite famously that there's another shoe to drop, and I think that clip's over 300,000 views, Kathleen, because people are waiting to know, is this the shoe? When will be the shoe? So while we have a premier who seems impervious to legal consequence or good timely legal oversight or the legal investigation. I mean, we've had Auditor General's reports come out. We've had all of this stuff come up around Staples and the money going to American workers at the expense of Canadian small businesses. And we saw with the Science Center, the justification didn't seem to land up with what happened. And we saw with Ontario Place, they put up fences and started bulldozing the park. I mean, this is a government that seems like it's getting away with everything that it wants to do. I want the RCMP to hurry up and let the people of Ontario know, because we need to be able to do a proper risk assessment. What is the risk of this government continuing to go unchallenged? The only thing I've ever seen Doug Ford respond to is public pressure. And the Lincoln quote that if you have the will of the people, you can do anything. When you don't, you can't do anything. I'm paraphrasing. But he didn't have the will of the people anymore on the Greenbelt grab. Right? And he almost didn't have it around the Science Center in Ontario Place, but for the fact that they flooded the zone with so many things to be angry about that people were getting exhausted. So, I mean, I think we need the RCMP to let us know where the Greenbelt scandal is at. I think we need to see some accountability. There was accountability in Dalton McGuinty's government around the gas plant scandal, right? We're not, your party has gone through accountability and scandal as well. When do we see the accountability other than, a cabinet minister who fell on his sword that one weekend and then now is back doing some lobbying gig? I mean, I think accountability is essential in a democracy. So I'm just wondering from you, as I always do, Kathleen, what is the call to action for people who are watching this and feeling my frustration and your frustration? I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for you to see so many of the things that you championed getting trampled on.
Well, I think this government, as you have said in so many words, that the government is getting away with a lot, and I think that what's going on with Trump south of the border has allowed them to get away with even more. And so bringing in a piece of legislation like this and slapping the Protect Ontario, I mean, every piece of legislation's got Protect Ontario on it now, because that's the cover. That's the fig leaf for I'm going to do whatever I want to do in terms of the environment. I'm going to do whatever I want to do in terms of developers. I'm going to protect myself as the premier from criticism because we're facing this threat from south of the border. I think that as the onus for that work shifts to the federal government, now that we have a new prime minister in place and a prime minister who was elected exactly to do that, I think that there will be the opportunity to hold this provincial premier more to account, because it's not his job anymore. He doesn't have to be Captain Canada. He stepped in, and you can have various opinions on how well he did that job, but he did it on a superficial level for a short period of time. It is now the prime minister's job to actually do that job. And the premier now is, I think, exposed to more criticism. And I think we're seeing that. This legislation is not sailing through. There's a lot of objection to it. There's going to be a lot of objection to education legislation that he's going to be introducing. So I think that he's going to start to get more pushback as his role vis-a-vis Trump recedes. I think that Doug Ford is probably really looking forward to the First Minister's meeting, because it gives him a chance to be on that stage again for a little while, because that stage is what has allowed him to get to where he is in this third mandate. But that's not going to last forever. First of all, he's not going to be the chair of the Council of the Federation of the Premiers for the rest of his term. He's had his time, and it will change, I think, again this summer. And so he's going to have to tend to business at home here in Ontario. And that's the opening for those of us who are really concerned about what he's doing to make it clear to him. And I think that has already begun.
Well, it's interesting, just in our final moments here, when we talk about the federal government and the role of Mark Carney, I agree. Mark Carney instantly took over the mantle of Captain Canada from Ford and managed to lock it in. Like I'm the one speaking for this country, and the premier's kind of said, okay, you go. Right. And Carney has done some, I think, pretty impressive things, not just from a vantage point of someone who decided to break my usual rule of supporting a campaign in a partisan election because I just didn't want MAGA, Trump, Poilievre in the role. So myself and I think a lot of other Canadians put aside our past voting habits or whatever and said, let's give this guy who knows the economy better than almost anyone in the world the chance to help Canada through an economic war. So Mark Carney has shown himself by world reviews, global reviews, to be highly competent. Bono even said that. He said, thanks, Canada, for hiring competent.
It must be true then.
Oh, absolutely. He's the prophet of our times. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
Huge fan.
Philosopher king.
Yeah. So for Bono to say, thank you, Canada, you showed us you can hire a populist, or you can hire competence, not populism. The world is applauding you for how you're handling Trump, etc. So Carney now has the stage, not Ford. And I think also Carney in the throne speech set out structures for fast tracking approvals with consultation, where he talked about here's how fast we need to do stuff, but here's how we're going to do it without circumventing these duty to consults, right? Now that's language he used. It was good language, but whether or not he can live up to that, or whether or not, as David Moskrop said to me on the last OShow, he's going to get mugged by reality of politics and how hard it is to move forward at that pace. I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic, but what I didn't hear from the Ford government, Kathleen, was when we get our new mandate, we are going to have to quickly do certain things and ramp up. And that's going to require fast tracking approvals. And so we're going to do that with our partners through a streamlined process. That doesn't sound like Bill 5. Bill 5 sounds like, here's what we're doing. Oops, didn't consult you, First Nations.
Right.
Our bad. Let's do a little tweak, make you feel good. And now we're going to go on and take all the power.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to distinguish between where different politicians start in their process, right? So Doug Ford starts from a place we know from, whether it's safe injection sites or whether it was COVID, whatever. He doesn't really pay attention to science, right? He's not really interested. Greenbelt, he doesn't really care, as you said. But that's not true of Mark Carney. He does care. He does believe that we are at risk in terms of our environmental degradation. He does believe that it's important to work with First Nations and Indigenous people. That's not something that has been a hallmark of Doug Ford's government ever since 2018. So the starting point for these politicians is very different. It will be interesting, given the First Minister's meeting next week, and given what's going on in Ontario now around Bill 5, what that conversation between Carney and Ford will be. Because Carney does not want to be tainted by the kind of irresponsible actions that a guy like Doug Ford is taking. He wants to move ahead. He wants to make good decisions. He wants efficiency, and he wants to move quickly. But he is not going to ride roughshod over due process, And so I think that, we have to pay attention to how he finesses that. It will be difficult. It's, none of this is easy. I would suggest that Doug Ford has probably made it more difficult by what he's doing in Ontario right now. But I believe that Carney, because of his starting point, because of his belief system, because he understands that he has to build relationships in the work that he's done throughout his career, he had to be able to build relationships. And clearly, given the network that he has, he's got relationships. So I have a lot of faith that he's going to be able to build relationships to do the things that he said he was going to do. And Doug Ford is going to have to fall in line with that, because that's the national agenda. He has said that that's what he's signing on for. So we'll see what happens at the First Minister's meeting. But I'm gonna put my money on where Mark Carney starts and his ability to move things forward, not on Doug Ford's.
My money is there as well. I'm not a gambler or a bettor, but if I were,
yeah, me either. But if I were,
yeah, it would be on Mark Carney, because as we said earlier, I think I messed up the saying, but past his prologue. If past his prologue, we've seen Doug Ford flop all over the place,
Yeah.
waste billions and billions of dollars on stupid deals, not come at things from any kind of sustainable scientific perspective, get tons of backlash, reverse himself. I mean, it's been a disaster. And he's only in, as you say, because of the Trump moment. Whereas Carney's got one of the best resumes ever of a Canadian prime minister, perfectly built for this moment in time, and so far has been impressing us. If he gets to Canada Day and he is able to not only get a single economy across this country, but also a big trade deal with the EU and the middle class tax cut by July 1st, I mean, it's going to be a hell of a Canada Day. So we'll see. We'll see. I was going to, I don't want to call them stretch goals because
those provincial trade barriers they're finicky, to say the least. You know, when we were there, we have an internal free trade agreement, but there are still challenges, and you can already hear some of the premiers from the maritime provinces saying, wait a minute. So we'll see what happens. But even if he can make progress along that continuum, that will be a good thing.
Well, we'll hold them to account, but I think, as I said to David, Carney's a high performer, and high performers love accountability. And if they don't meet their goals, they work harder. They don't They don't get defensive and angry and give up. So I'm hoping.
Exactly.
I hope if we all watch Carney will take that as fuel. And I want to thank you so much for being here again, Kathleen. You're always so candid and give us such a perspective, because none of us have sat in the Premier's chair. There's a handful in Ontario who have ever had the privilege, and you have an understanding of both Doug Ford's opportunities and his risks and the choices he's making and the choices perhaps he should be making. So I'd love to have you back on again in the future. Thank you to everybody who subscribes to the OShow. Let's get it to 5,000. We're building a national conversation around protecting our democracy. It's so important, as we've just had in this conversation now with Kathleen. We have to be aware democracy is not a passive activity. You have to be paying attention no matter how many elections exhaust you, no matter how much you feel overwhelmed or disenfranchised or frustrated, or you just want to give up because it feels like sometimes the bad guys always win. You have to stay in the fight. Rest, then get back up and get back in the fight. And so I appreciate Kathleen Wynne. You could be retired off somewhere doing something fun, but here you are.
Apparently not. Apparently I couldn't be.
We need you, Kathleen. You're right. You're being voluntold. You cannot leave.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's listened.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Take care.
Take care.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the OShow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the OShow. It's the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. And with a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the OShow. Yeah, there's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the OShow. You gotta stand for something or fall for it all. Canada, you hear the call of the OShow. It's a podcast, the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. Stay informed with the OShow, OShow.
Your merch bin.